The morning light crept through the thin white curtains, painting soft gold on the walls of Rebecca's apartment. Steam rose from the coffee mug on the kitchen counter, untouched. In front of the mirror, she adjusted the lace strap of her wedding dress with slow precision, like someone checking the details of a crime scene rather than a celebration. Everything appeared perfect. The ivory fabric, the neat curls pinned into place, the delicate silver earrings catching the light. Yet her eyes told a different story. They were calm, too calm, as if they had seen too much to ever reflect pure joy again. The sound of Austin waking up filtered through the window, a distant hum of traffic, a dog barking, a siren somewhere far away. Rebecca exhaled, slowly, holding her gaze in the mirror. She looked at herself not as a bride, but as a soldier preparing for the last act of a long campaign. Her hands didn't tremble. They never did. As she fastened the small pearl bracelet on her wrist, her reflection blurred, not from tears, but from memory. She saw herself as a little girl again, standing barefoot in a hospital corridor in San Antonio, clutching a paper cup of orange juice while nurses whispered that her mother wouldn't wake up. She had been 10. Her father had promised everything would be fine. But within months he was lost to the bottle, and within a year, gone entirely, a car wreck after a night of drinking. The foster homes came next, white walls, numbered beds, and voices that called her a good kid as long as she followed rules. Rebecca learned quickly. Never cry in front of others, never ask twice for anything, and never let anyone see you break. Pain became discipline. Discipline became armor. By the time she turned 18, she'd already outgrown the system and the idea of depending on anyone. College was paid for through scholarships and extra shifts at a diner near the university. Every morning she woke before dawn, folded her blanket with military precision, and ran a mile before classes. That routine stayed with her. Even now, on her wedding day, her alarm had gone off at 5:30 a.m. sharp. She'd brewed her coffee, reviewed her checklist, and laid out the emergency kit in her purse, not for makeup, but for things she might actually need: tissues, breath mints, a phone charger, and a flash drive hidden in a lipstick case. The smell of perfume mixed with the faint scent of fresh rain drifting through the open window. Rebecca adjusted the train of her dress and smiled faintly, a smile of control, not excitement. She had waited for this day longer than anyone knew. Every step, every gesture, every word had been rehearsed for months. Yet beneath the calm there was a pulse, something buried between nerves and vengeance. A small framed photograph sat on her vanity. A man in his early 30s smiling, holding a camera. Daniel Brooks, the only man who had ever made her feel safe, before the world took him away. Her thumb brushed over the glass. "Almost there," she whispered under her breath, though whether she was speaking to him or herself, no one could say. The room was silent again, except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Rebecca checked her watch, aligning it with the second hand. Always on time, always ready. Then came the soft buzz from her phone. A text lit up the screen. "Your ride will arrive in 5 minutes." Her reflection stared back, composed, flawless, unreadable. The bride everyone expected to see. But no one truly knew. She took one last sip of cold coffee, set the cup aside, and whispered, "Let's finish this." Outside, the city kept moving, unaware that this wedding morning was not the beginning of a love story, but the closing chapter of something much darker. A year before the wedding, the air inside the downtown Austin gym smelled of metal and citrus cleaner. Rebecca remembered it clearly the day she first saw Landon Hart. He was at the far end of the room, spotting a friend at the bench press, his posture relaxed, his laughter genuine. She had read every file about him before that day. Age 32, business degree from Rice, son of Margaret and Charles Hart, owners of Hart Holdings. A multi-million-dollar empire built on construction contracts, real estate deals, and a long list of shell companies that kept investigators busy and frustrated. To the world, They were philanthropists. To the Austin Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, they were suspects in a network of money laundering and extortion. Rebecca had been assigned by Captain Robert Hale to go undercover. "Get close to the son," he'd said. "He's clean. He might lead us to something his parents slipped up on." It wasn't the kind of case she'd imagined when she joined the force. But after what happened to Daniel Brooks, the man she'd loved and buried, she had asked for it. Revenge dressed as justice. That first meeting had been simple enough. Landon noticed her struggling with a piece of equipment and offered help, his tone easy, unguarded. She thanked him, pretending not to know who he was. They talked about photography, his passion, his escape from the corporate world. He told her how the light in Texas was different, sharper, how it split truth from shadow. She smiled and said she'd always wanted to learn. That night, back in her apartment, she searched online for beginner photography courses and signed up for 3. Over the following months, their paths crossed by chance in coffee shops near his office, at the same running trail by Lady Bird Lake, and eventually at a charity gala for urban development projects, one of the Heart's public relations jewels. Rebecca played her role perfectly, independent, warm, quietly mysterious. She let Landon see the version of her that wasn't a cop or a survivor, just a woman who loved light, color, and small talk about ordinary things. But the closer she got, the harder it became to separate the mission from the man. He was kind in ways his parents were not. When he spoke about his future, it wasn't about power or money. It was about freedom, starting his own studio, photographing stories that mattered. Each word made her chest tighten with something she didn't want to name. She sent her reports to Captain Hale on schedule, each one clinical, precise, devoid of emotion. Yet every time she hit send, she felt a piece of herself fracture. Love wasn't supposed to return to her life. Not here. Not with him. But it did, quietly, dangerously. Now, standing in her apartment in the present, Rebecca could almost smell the gym's metallic air again. She could hear Landon's laughter. Remember the way he looked at her through the camera lens the first time he took her photo, unaware that she was framing him, too, for a very different picture. A sharp honk echoed from the street below, jolting her back to reality. Her phone buzzed again. The message was clear. Her ride to the wedding had arrived. Outside, the morning sun glared against the rusted hood of an old sedan that idled by the curb. The exhaust coughed in uneven bursts, sending thin wisps of smoke curling into the air. Rebecca paused at her apartment door, taking in the sight. The car's paint was peeling, its bumper dented, the leather seats visible through cracked windows. The license plate, almost unreadable, trembled as the engine rattled. Margaret Hart's message couldn't have been clearer if it had been engraved on the hood. "You don't belong in our world." Rebecca closed the door behind her and descended the stairs, the hem of her gown brushing lightly against each step. The driver, an older man in a worn suit, avoided her eyes as he opened the door. Inside, the car smelled of cigarette smoke and stale air. A wilted air freshener swung from the rearview mirror. Shaped like a pine tree, but long past its purpose, she settled into the seat with composure, smoothing her dress. The engine sputtered, then groaned forward. The ride to Lake Travis felt endless. Traffic shimmered in the heat, and every bump in the road sent a jolt through the seat springs. Rebecca looked out the window, her reflection in the glass superimposed over the skyline of downtown Austin. Beneath the veil and makeup, she looked calm, almost serene. Yet, behind that stillness lived a storm years in the making. The car pulled up to the circular drive of the Hart Country Club and Event Hall, an ivory building with fountains and white roses cascading along the entrance. Guests in elegant attire turned to look as the rusty sedan came to a stop among luxury SUVs and black sedans. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Cameras clicked. Someone whispered, "That's the bride." Rebecca stepped out gracefully, ignoring the whispers. The sun caught the edge of her veil, turning it to a shimmer of silver light. She thanked the driver and walked toward the entrance, every movement measured and unhurried. A few guests exchanged glances, uncomfortable under her quiet confidence. Inside the venue, chandeliers sparkled above a room dressed in white and gold. Waiters glided between tables, refilling champagne glasses. At the far end stood Margaret Hart, immaculate in a navy silk dress, pearls around her throat like armor. Her smile was sharp, practiced, and entirely without warmth. "Oh, Rebecca," Margaret said, her tone honeyed but cold. "I was worried you wouldn't make it. I hope the car was suitable." Rebecca met her eyes. "It got me here," she replied softly. "That's all that matters." The faintest flicker crossed Margaret's expression, a mix of annoyance and disbelief. Landon appeared from behind her, relief breaking across his face. "You're here," he breathed, taking Rebecca's hands. His sincerity disarmed the tension for a moment. Around them the music swelled. But Margaret wasn't finished. She lifted a microphone from the nearby stage and tapped it twice, the sound cutting through the chatter. "Before we begin," she announced sweetly, "I'd love to say a few words about our lovely bride." The guests turned toward her. Rebecca felt the air tighten. She stood still, her posture poised, her eyes fixed on the woman who had spent months underestimating her. Margaret smiled for the crowd, the perfect hostess, every word ready to wound beneath its polish. And as the music faded into silence, she began. The wedding hall shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, the air heavy with perfume and money. Every guest seemed dressed in confidence and silk, their laughter crisp, rehearsed. At the center stood Margaret Hart, her navy gown gleaming under the lights, pearls shining like a declaration of power. She raised the microphone with the ease of someone who had commanded rooms her entire life. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, voice soft, practiced, dangerously sweet. "Before we begin this beautiful ceremony, I'd like to say a few words about the woman my son has chosen." The crowd quieted. Rebecca stood near the floral arch, her hands loosely folded, expression unreadable. Landon, standing beside her, smiled nervously. Margaret's lips curled just slightly. It's remarkable, really, how love can be found in the most unexpected places. Some people are born into legacy. Others, well, they find creative ways to climb. Uneasy chuckles rolled through the audience. Rebecca didn't move. "She comes from the state system, you know," Margaret continued, lowering her voice just enough to sound conspiratorial, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "A foster girl. No family. No heritage. No name worth remembering. But my son, ever the dreamer, decided to save her. Isn't that sweet?" The laughter this time was forced, brittle. Rebecca felt the sound echo in her chest like a drumbeat. The words didn't wound her, they confirmed what she already knew. Margaret needed power to feel alive. And Rebecca was about to take it from her. Her phone, hidden within the folds of her gown, vibrated once. She glanced down discreetly. A single message from Captain Hale flashed on the screen. Green light. Rebecca's pulse steadied. She inhaled slowly, then stepped forward. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the second microphone at the podium. Margaret blinked, momentarily thrown off. "Oh, of course, dear." Rebecca took the mic, her tone calm, even warm. "Thank you, Margaret. You've shared such heartfelt words. But there's something the guests deserve to know before this celebration continues." The hall went still. Landon turned toward her, confusion flickering in his eyes. Rebecca straightened her posture, the soft fabric of her gown shifting like armor. "My name," she said clearly, "is Detective Rebecca Miller, Austin Police Department, Financial Crimes Division." Gasps cut through the silence. Somewhere in the back, a glass shattered against the floor. Margaret's smile froze, color draining from her face. Rebecca continued, her voice unwavering. Under the authority of the Travis County District Court, we are executing arrest warrants for Margaret Hart and Charles Hart on charges of racketeering, extortion, and murder for hire. The heavy doors at the back of the hall swung open. Armed officers entered in formation, their badges glinting under the chandeliers. The guests recoiled, murmuring, filming, whispering in disbelief. Margaret's knees buckled. "This is insane. You can't." Rebecca handed the microphone to an officer and produced the folded documents from her clutch. "These warrants are signed by Judge Kleinman," she said coolly. "You can contest them in court." 2 officers stepped forward. Margaret resisted for only a moment before her pearl necklace snapped, scattering across the marble floor like hailstones. Charles Hart stood motionless, pale, as the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. Landon's face was a portrait of devastation. "Rebecca," he whispered, barely audible. "What is this?" She turned to him, her eyes soft but distant. "The truth," she said simply, as the officers escorted his parents out. Flashes from phones lit the room like lightning. Guests began to disperse, voices rising in confusion and fear. Rebecca lowered the microphone and stepped away from the stage. Outside, beyond the chaos, the late morning light shimmered on Lake Travis. She walked toward it slowly, each step echoing on the marble floor. Behind her, the wedding music played on loop, an unfinished song for a ceremony that would never happen. By the time the doors closed behind her, the laughter, the gasps, the shouting, all of it had faded into silence. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant thrum of city traffic. Rebecca sat on the floor in her wedding gown. The hem wrinkled and darkened where it touched the hardwood. The bouquet lay discarded beside her, petals scattered like debris after a storm. Outside, Austin glowed with neon and noise, but here the world felt muted, hollow. The mission was complete. The names that had haunted her for years, Margaret and Charles Hart, were now written on official arrest warrants. Justice, she thought, and yet it didn't feel like victory. Her eyes drifted to the small photograph on the nightstand, a man with kind eyes and a half-smile, holding a camera at arm's length. Daniel Brooks. The reason it had all begun. The memory came back to her like a reel of light and sound. Years earlier, on a summer evening in San Antonio, she'd been rushing from work, heels clicking on the sidewalk, when her shoe strap broke clean through. She had crouched awkwardly near a lamppost, trying to fix it with a paperclip, when a voice behind her said, "You look like you could use an engineer." She looked up to find Daniel, tall, dressed in a mechanic's shirt with a name patch stitched over the pocket, a grin disarming in its warmth. He knelt, produced a small screwdriver from his bag, and fixed her shoe in under a minute. She laughed, embarrassed. He offered to buy her coffee as payment for manual labor. That was the beginning. Their love wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, steady, filled with shared breakfasts and laughter that belonged to no one else. Daniel ran a small manufacturing company, modest but honest. He believed in hard work, integrity, and giving second chances to people who'd been overlooked. Much like Rebecca herself, he never asked too many questions about her past, and she never had to hide behind armor when she was with him. For the first time, she'd allowed herself to believe in safety. Then, one evening, he didn't come home. The police found his car abandoned near an industrial site outside Austin. Days later, they recovered his body from a drainage canal, shot twice in the chest. The official story called it a robbery gone wrong. But Rebecca knew better. Daniel's company had recently refused a buyout offer from Hart Logistics, one of several subsidiaries tied to Margaret and Charles Hart. He'd told her, half-jokingly, that they didn't take no for an answer. Weeks after the funeral, Captain Robert Hale appeared at her door. He was younger then, still carrying the idealism that police work hadn't yet burned away. "We have reason to believe your fiancé's death wasn't random," he'd said. "The hearts have connections, dirty ones. But getting to them will take time, patience, and someone who can get close." Rebecca had sat perfectly still, listening. Her grief had crystallized into something sharp, cold, and unyielding. "Then teach me," she told him. "I'll do whatever it takes." That night, alone with Daniel's photo, she made a silent promise. "I'll find them. I'll make them answer for what they did. I don't care how long it takes." Years of training followed. Long nights at the academy, cases that tested her endurance. And finally, the assignment that brought her face to face with the very people who had taken everything from her. The rest was execution, one careful move after another until the truth stood exposed in front of hundreds of witnesses. Now, sitting in the quiet of her apartment, Rebecca traced the outline of Daniel's face through the glass. "It's done," she whispered, but her voice cracked halfway through. The promise had been fulfilled, yet her heart felt as hollow as the empty side of the bed beside her. Outside, the city carried on. Cars, laughter, the rhythm of lives untouched by hers. Rebecca leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes. The mission was over. Justice had been served. And yet, in the echo of the silence, she realized that justice had never been the same thing as peace. 3 days after the wedding, the offices of Hart Enterprises no longer smelled of money and order, but of fear. The marble floors were streaked with footprints, half-packed boxes cluttered the hallways, and every monitor displayed the same breaking news headline: "Local business titans arrested, federal charges pending." Reporters swarmed the sidewalks outside the downtown tower, their voices echoing through the glass as if the whole city were feeding on the fall of a dynasty. Landon Hart stood by the window of his corner office, staring out at the skyline that his parents had once claimed as their kingdom. The blinds were half drawn, stripes of gray light cutting across his face. He looked smaller somehow, his once polished appearance replaced by a weary, sleepless disarray. His tie hung loose, his eyes bloodshot. The phone on his desk buzzed relentlessly. Lawyers, board members, journalists, but he didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. His father's arrest had frozen all company accounts. Every client had backed out within 48 hours. By noon, half the staff had resigned. The receptionist had cried while handing him her badge. The janitor had avoided eye contact. He sank into his chair, the weight of everything pressing against his chest. Just a week ago, he had believed in legacy, in building something honorable out of his parents' empire. Now, he didn't even know what that empire truly was. He replayed the wedding scene in his mind, the sirens, the handcuffs, the look on Rebecca's face when she said her name and badge number. Detective, not fiancé, not partner, not love, just truth. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was David, his operations manager. "Sir," he began hesitantly, "the auditors are here. They need access to the servers." Landon nodded without turning around. "Give them everything. Everything." He finally looked up. "If it burns, let it burn." David hesitated, then nodded and left quietly. Rain began to fall, slow and heavy against the glass. The sound filled the room like static. Landon pressed his palms against his eyes, breathing hard, trying to find something solid to hold on to. He reached for his phone, scrolling through contacts until he landed on her name, Rebecca Miller. For a long time, his thumb hovered above the screen. He didn't call. He couldn't. Instead, he stood, grabbed his coat, and walked out. The receptionist didn't even look up as he passed. By the time he reached the parking garage, the rain had turned to a downpour. He climbed into his car and sat there for a moment, the engine idling, the wipers swiping furiously against the glass. The world outside blurred into streaks of light and shadow. He drove with no destination, the city dissolving around him as the highway opened wide and empty. His thoughts raced faster than the tires: anger, betrayal, humiliation, grief. Every mile felt like a confession he couldn't speak aloud. He saw flashes of her in the rain, the way she'd looked at him that night, calm and merciless. Lightning split the sky. A horn blared. The car hydroplaned as he took a curve too fast. For one suspended heartbeat, the world tilted sideways. Then came the crash, metal, glass, silence. Back in her apartment, Rebecca sat at her desk, the case files still open in front of her. She hadn't slept since the arrests. When her phone rang, she almost didn't pick up. "Detective Miller," a voice said. "This is St. David's Hospital. Are you listed as an emergency contact for Mr. Landon Hart?" Her throat went dry. "Yes. Why?" The voice hesitated. "He's been admitted following a car accident. He's in critical condition." Rebecca froze. The receiver pressed to her ear. Outside, sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder, then fading, until all that remained was the steady, mechanical rhythm of hospital monitors echoing in her mind. The sterile hum of fluorescent lights filled the ICU corridor. Rebecca's footsteps echoed softly against the linoleum floor as she followed a nurse to the end of the hallway. Behind the glass door, Landon Hart lay motionless, surrounded by machines that breathed for him. Tubes and wires snaked across his body. The rhythm of the heart monitor steady but fragile. His skin was pale, the kind of pallor that belongs to those caught between this world and the next. Rebecca froze at the threshold. The smell of antiseptic mixed with something metallic and bitter. For the first time in years, her composure cracked. She had seen bodies before. Crime scenes colder than this, but never one that mattered. Never one that carried the ghost of every choice she'd made. She stepped closer to the bed. The sound of machines filling the silence she couldn't break. His hand, limp against the white sheet, still bore the faint tan lines where his watch had been. She reached for it slowly, her fingers trembling as they brushed his skin. It was warm. "Landon," she whispered, "I didn't mean for it to end like this." Her voice caught in her throat, the words uneven. "You were the only part of this plan that wasn't supposed to hurt." Memories flickered, his laughter echoing through her apartment, the way he framed her in photographs, telling her she looked like sunlight on film. All of it had been real, even if it had started with a lie. "I'm sorry," she breathed, leaning closer. "I love you." The monitors hummed on, indifferent. Then, faintly, impossibly, his fingers twitched. Rebecca blinked, thinking it was her imagination. But the movement came again, subtle, deliberate. His hand pressed weakly against hers. "Doctor!" she shouted, stumbling backward. Nurses rushed in, followed by a physician in blue scrubs. He moved his hand, he responded. The room burst into motion. Orders were called, vitals checked, lights adjusted. Rebecca stepped aside, her pulse racing. Through the chaos, she saw Landon's eyelids flutter once before slipping closed again. But it was enough. He was still there. Weeks passed in fragments. Rebecca visited daily, often sitting in silence beside his bed. She arranged his discharge with the hospital staff, using what remained of her savings to secure home care equipment. When he was finally stable enough to leave, she drove him herself to his family's house in Westlake Hills, the mansion that had once been a symbol of arrogance, now reduced to a quiet shell. She helped him settle into the downstairs room, where sunlight streamed through the tall windows. Physical therapy sessions were scheduled twice a week. The doctors were cautious with their optimism. The spinal trauma had left him paralyzed from the waist down. Perhaps temporarily, perhaps not. Landon barely spoke. He spent hours staring at the trees outside, his reflection faint in the glass. When Rebecca brought him food, he pushed the tray away. When she tried to talk, he turned his head. One evening, she placed a blanket over his legs, and he flinched as if her touch burned. You shouldn't be here, he said quietly, his voice raw. You got what you wanted. My parents are gone. The case is over. Leave the rest. She tried to answer, but the words dissolved on her tongue. She wanted to tell him that justice had never been revenge, that she hadn't expected love to survive the truth, but nothing she said could erase the damage. That night, as she sat in the empty kitchen, the clock ticking too loudly, a knock came at the door. Standing there was Dr. Tessa Morales, her old friend from the department. The psychologist gave her a measured look. You can't save him by guilt alone, Tessa said gently, but maybe there's another way. Rebecca frowned, exhausted. Another way. Tessa smiled faintly. Something small. Something alive. Rebecca didn't understand yet, but the next morning she would. The Austin Animal Center smelled faintly of disinfectant and wet fur. The fluorescent lights buzzed above as Rebecca walked slowly down the narrow aisle of kennels, each one holding a pair of hopeful or frightened eyes. The air was heavy with barks and soft whimpers, but one sound caught her attention, a weak, uneven yelp from the far corner. Inside a small cage lay a copper-colored puppy with one bandaged leg and formatted near his ear. His eyes, impossibly large for his frail frame, met hers through the bars. He didn't bark again. He simply watched her, his tail twitching once, tentative and shy. The shelter volunteer beside her side. That one's been here a while. Broke his leg when a truck hit him out by the river. Surgery went well, but he's slow to recover. Nobody wants a limping dog. Rebecca crouched down, resting her fingers against the cage door. The puppy inched forward, his movements clumsy but determined. What's his name? She asked quietly. They called him Copper, the volunteer said. Like his color and, the old movie. Copper licked her fingertips through the bars. His tongue was warm, alive. Rebecca smiled for the first time in weeks. I'll take him. The paperwork took an hour. She listened half-heartedly to the instructions about medication, rehabilitation, diet, and patience. Patience, she'd had a lifetime of that. When the volunteer placed Copper gently in her arms, he whimpered once, then buried his nose into the crook of her elbow as if he already understood safety. That afternoon, she drove to Westlake Hills, the puppy asleep on a blanket in the passenger seat. The house loomed quiet and sterile against the overcast sky. Landon hadn't left his bed in 2 days. His physical therapist had canceled the morning session after he refused to engage. Rebecca carried Copper inside, his small body trembling as she whispered softly, "Let's see if we can wake him up." Landon was sitting near the window, staring blankly outside. The wheelchair cast a long shadow across the hardwood floor. When Rebecca entered, he barely glanced up. "Another pity visit," he muttered. She ignored the edge in his voice. "Not exactly," she said, setting the puppy down. Copper stumbled forward on his splinted leg, sniffing the air. Landon's eyes followed him, confusion replacing bitterness. The puppy limped closer until he reached the foot of the wheelchair, looked up and wagged his tail once. Then, with a small effort, he climbed onto Landon's lap. Landon froze. Copper sniffed his hands and licked one softly. Something broke inside the silence, a crack so faint it could have been mistaken for the sound of a heart remembering how to beat. Rebecca said nothing. She watched as Landon's expression shifted, pain giving way to something else, an unfamiliar gentleness. He hesitated, then reached out, stroking the dog's head. Copper pressed closer, content. Over the next few days, Copper became a quiet rhythm in the house. His limp improved little by little. He followed Landon everywhere, curling beside his wheelchair during therapy sessions, resting his chin on his lap when the exercises grew too painful. When Landon dropped the ball during one session, Copper retrieved it awkwardly, tail wagging with triumph. The therapist laughed. So did Landon, an unsteady, broken sound that turned into something almost human again. Rebecca watched from the kitchen doorway one morning as sunlight streamed through the windows. Landon sat by the patio door, a mug of coffee beside him. Copper curled at his feet. His hand rested on the dog's head, fingers absently tracing the fur. She caught him whispering, "We're both a little broken." Huh. Days turned into weeks. Therapy strengthened his legs. Sensation began to return. First a twitch, then a step. Copper healed too, learning to run again. Awkwardly at first. Then with joy. The house, once filled with silence and regret, now carried the faint sound of laughter, the shuffle of footsteps, the clink of food bowls. One evening, Rebecca came home late from a follow-up at the precinct. Through the window, she saw Landon standing by the counter, his hand resting on the edge for balance, Copper circling his feet. She didn't call out. She just stood there, letting the moment wash over her, the man she'd nearly lost, the life she'd never expected to rebuild. A year later, the morning sun poured through the same window, warm and golden. The wheelchair sat untouched near the wall, its wheels gathering dust. Copper dozed on the rug, one paw draped over Landon's shoe. Rebecca poured coffee, smiled faintly, and thought of how healing sometimes arrived, not with grand gestures, but with small, steady steps and a heartbeat curled beside your feet. The marble floors of the Blanton Museum of Art gleamed under soft afternoon light. Photographs lined the gallery walls, sepia landscapes, portraits of weathered faces, and glimpses of small, unremarkable moments made radiant through the lens. A placard near the entrance read, "Resilience, a journey through light, photographs by Landon Hart." Rebecca stood near the back of the crowd, hands folded in front of her, watching as guests drifted from frame to frame. Each photo carried a story she knew too well. A wounded bird perched on a branch, a rain-slicked highway reflecting the first rays of dawn, a broken wheel abandoned in wild grass. Images of loss, but also survival. Reporters filled the space, microphones flashing, voices overlapping in admiration. Landon moved slowly among them, walking with the faintest limp, a trace of the man he used to be, and a badge of what he'd become. His dark suit fit perfectly, his hair swept back, his posture composed. Yet there was no arrogance in him now. Every gesture felt grounded, real. "Mr. Hart," one journalist called out, "your work has been described as both painful and hopeful. What inspired this collection?" Landon paused, glancing toward Rebecca across the room. Their eyes met for a heartbeat, and something unspoken passed between them. He turned back to the microphone. "I suppose it's about finding light in places that used to feel empty," he said. "Sometimes we don't get to choose what breaks us, but we can choose what comes after." Applause rippled through the crowd. Rebecca smiled softly, pride and ache intertwined. She remembered the nights he'd sat by the window, Copper curled at his feet, struggling to hold a camera again. How he'd dropped it once, furious, until the dog rested a paw on his leg, grounding him back to the moment. The first photo he took after that, the sunlight on Copper's fur, was now framed in the center of the exhibit. As the crowd thinned, Rebecca stepped closer to one photograph, a quiet shot of a highway disappearing into mist. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "For those who stayed when I couldn't." Her breath caught. "Beautiful, isn't it?" a man's voice said beside her. She turned to see an older taxi driver, holding his cap respectfully. "I didn't know he was famous till today," the man continued, nodding toward Landon. "Saw his picture on the poster downtown and told my daughter. She's been fighting depression for a year. His photos, the ones about healing, they got her to pick up her camera again." He smiled, his eyes shining. "Tell him thank you, will you?" Rebecca's throat tightened. "I will," she whispered. The evening mellowed into golden hour, sunlight pouring through the glass ceiling. Guests drifted out, leaving behind the quiet murmur of closing conversations. Landon stood near the last display, a photograph of Lake Travis at dusk, the water glowing like molten glass. Reporters lingered at a respectful distance, watching him sign programs and shake hands. When the final applause faded, the gallery lights dimmed, leaving the soft glow of the photographs behind. Landon handed his pen to a staff member, exhaled deeply, and turned toward Rebecca. She hadn't moved, still standing near the frame of the lake, her expression both proud and distant, as if she were looking at something sacred she could never quite touch. He walked to her slowly, his limp barely noticeable now. Copper trotted quietly behind, tail wagging, a small symbol of all the healing they'd fought for. The crowd's noise faded into silence until only the faint click of a camera shutter remained. Landon stopped in front of her. "Thank you for coming," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of everything they hadn't yet said. Rebecca smiled, the corners of her eyes glistening. "I wouldn't have missed it for the world." Outside, the lights of the museum shimmered against the deepening Austin sky. Inside, surrounded by his art, Landon finally felt whole. And as the guests began to applaud one last time, he turned toward Rebecca, ready to say what had been waiting in his heart since the day everything broke. The gallery had gone quiet. Only the echo of footsteps and the faint hum of the lights remained as staff moved through the space, turning switches, lowering shades, and packing away the last of the event materials. The air still carried the faint scent of perfume and champagne, but beneath it lingered something deeper relief. Rebecca stood by the final photograph, her fingers tracing the edge of its frame. The image was of Lady Bird Lake at twilight, the sky streaked with violet and amber, the water calm enough to mirror the world above it. The caption read simply, "Peace doesn't need to be loud." She smiled faintly, knowing exactly when and where he had taken it. Behind her, she heard soft footsteps approach, slower than most, but steady. Landon stopped a few feet away, hands in his pockets, looking around the now empty gallery. "I can't tell if I'm proud," he said quietly, "or just grateful it's over." Rebecca turned to face him. "You should be both." He gave a small laugh, the sound low and genuine. "You know, when they told me forgiveness was part of healing, I thought it was a polite way of saying forget. But it's not. It's remembering without bleeding." She nodded. "That's what survival really is." For a long moment, neither spoke. The light from the glass ceiling had softened to gold, bathing the photographs in a warm afterglow. Copper, now older but still spry, padded between them, sniffing the air as if sensing the shift. Landon stepped closer. "You stayed," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "even when you didn't have to." Rebecca met his gaze. "I didn't stay out of guilt," she said. "I stayed because leaving would have meant giving up on the only good thing that came out of all that pain." Something in his expression changed then, years of exhaustion giving way, to something unguarded and tender. He reached out, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his chin resting gently on her shoulder. The weight of him wasn't heavy, it was grounding. His breath was warm against her ear when he whispered, "Marry me again." Rebecca froze for just a second, as if her heart had forgotten how to process softness after so much sharpness. She turned slightly, meeting his eyes. They were steady, filled with a quiet certainty that words couldn't hold. Tears blurred her vision before she could stop them. "You really think we can start over?" she asked, her voice trembling. He smiled faintly. "We already did." Rebecca pressed her forehead against his chest, letting the warmth of his heartbeat steady hers. For once, she didn't think about justice or promises or all the years lost to anger. She just stood there, breathing in the moment, the smell of him, the softness of his voice, the truth that forgiveness didn't erase the past but redefined it. Later, they walked out of the museum hand in hand. The city stretched around them, glowing beneath the Texas dusk. Copper trotted ahead, his copper-colored for catching the fading light like a spark of something eternal. They reached the edge of Lady Bird Lake, the water rippling with the reflection of the skyline. Landon paused, looking out over the surface that shimmered in gold and silver. "It's strange," he said quietly. "The same lake where I almost ended everything. Now it feels like where everything begins again." Rebecca squeezed his hand. "That's what redemption does. It changes how the story sounds in your head." The sun slipped lower, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber. For a long while they simply stood there, watching Copper chase the breeze along the shoreline, the ripples following him like echoes of laughter long overdue. Rebecca leaned her head against Landon's shoulder, her voice soft but certain. "Some justice comes through handcuffs," she said, "others through forgiveness." And as the light faded over Austin, their silhouettes merged with the glow. Two souls finally free, not because they'd forgotten the past, but because they'd learned how to walk beyond it.